Суки, підари. Фосфор.
Так, це скільки? Десь минута ще, то слідуючий буде опять. Тобто нам проскочить, так.
Тут, блядь, хрен его знает, как его, блядь.
It is recognizable that the Russians are holding back with massive attacks on the city of Pokrovsk itself. In my opinion, they want to take possession of the city as intact as possible. They can then use Pokrovsk as their logistics hub. You must not forget, all the cities east of Pokrovsk are almost razed to the ground. These were the words of Colonel Marcus Reisner from a recent interview on the situation near Pokrovsk. And this insightful interview will cover the bulk of today's video later on when we deal with the Pokrovsk front. Now, the Russian command, ahead of Trump's inauguration, made a series of statements aimed at convincing the new US president of Russia's inevitable victory in Ukraine. They claimed to have occupied Toretsk, nearly taken Chasiv Yar, captured the last villages in the Luhansk region, encircled Kupiansk and Borova in the Kharkiv region, advanced to the Dnipro region, and even entered Pokrovsk. Ukraine, however, counterclaims that all of this is false and a mere attempt to deceive, and I quote directly here from a Ukrainian report. Their subservient electorate, while also exerting pressure on Western partners. In reality, however, the way I see it is that much of what the Russians claim, even though there may be some occasional exaggeration, is nonetheless a realistic picture of the front. Currently, the southern Donbas region from Velyka, Novosilka to Pokrovsk is in the final stages of collapse. In Velyka, Novosilka, the city can be safely described as being in its final days of defense. After amassing resources, the Russians launched a massive offensive on the town, which is the last defense stronghold on the southern front of the Donetsk region. Russian forces attacked from 5 directions, having previously prepared landing zones and encircled the city on 3 sides. The Kurakhove sector seems to be, at least comparatively, the most stable of the 3. After the complete occupation of Kurakhove, the Russians likely aimed to quickly capture Dachny and advanced west along both flanks of the Vovcha River towards Ukrainian fortified positions in Andriivka and Ukalky. However, the Ukrainian forces are holding positions in Dachny. Pokrovsk, however, is a totally different story. So today we do a frontline update for the week of January 15th to the 22nd. We will focus on the Pokrovsk front mainly and include a very insightful interview with Austrian Colonel Marcus Reisner. But first, I will take you through the southern Donbas sectors of Kurakhove and Velyka Novosilka before wrapping up with the Pokrovsk analysis. Now, some of you may be aware that I have a new addition to my family, and therefore the frequency of my videos may decline just a bit for the next week or 2. I will still be frequent with my videos on content for my channel members of all 4 tiers of membership. I reiterate my appreciation for your support in this regard, as well as to all those who have donated via super thanks, as it helps keep this channel running financially. The end screen will contain an informative but graphic trailer of what to expect when you join the membership community. So let's get into it. Russian forces attacked from 5 directions, having previously prepared landing zones and encircled the city of Velyka Novosilka on 3 sides. From the south, the Russian troops managed to capture the villages of Netskuchny and Vremivka, advancing north along the Mori-Yali River to cut off Ukrainian forces' retreat route. From the north, the Russians launched a broad assault on the road leading into the city, coming close to the outskirts of Velyka Novosilka and beginning their attack. From the southeast and east, Russian troops entered the city and seized several villages. Velyka Novosilka is strategically located between 2 rivers, allowing it to hold out for a long time. but the cutting off of logistics and the attempt to encircle it would prevent such defense. If reinforcements do not arrive to break the blockade of the roads into the city, the defense will likely collapse in the near future. Now, after the complete occupation of Kurakhove, the Russians aimed to quickly capture Dachny and advance west along the banks of the Vovcha River towards Ukrainian fortified positions in Andriivka and Ukalky. However, the Ukrainian defense forces are holding positions in Dachny. The Ukrainian military also launched a counteroffensive, pushing Russian occupiers back from Andriivka to Shevchenko. Intense fighting has returned to this village, which the Ukrainian forces have been attacking for the second consecutive week.
Давай виходи, я крию.
Additionally, Ukraine's defense line along the Suky Yali River seems to be holding firm. Despite the Russians capturing the village of Yantani, which lies along the road to Dachny, the entire area north of the village of Konstantinopolsky, as well as crossing the river of the village of Suky Yali, the Russians' plan to advance north of Zelenivka has failed. Here, the Ukrainian forces counterattacked, retaking part of the territory on the northern bank of the river and pushing the Russians out of half of Zelenivka. As a result, for the time being, the Ukrainian forces have thwarted the Russian plan to advance on Ukalky and Constantinople from the south. Meanwhile, Russian forces have made unsuccessful attempts to advance on another front from Rozdolny to Bogatyv to bypass Ukrainian fortifications. On the northern flank of the post-Kurakhove front, the Russians are advancing from Slovianka and Petropavlivka to the west to cut off the road to Andriivka and attempt to encircle the Ukrainian stronghold from the north. Over the course of a week, the Russian advance has covered just over 2.5 kilometers. It is likely that by next week, the Russians will approach the northern outskirts of Andriivka and begin to storm it. The Ukrainian defense forces will eventually have to retreat from the Kurakhove salient, but for now, their rearguard actions are tying down a significant portion of Russian forces, hopefully, as they think, preventing them from advancing on Pokrovsk. In the Novopavlivka sector, between Pokrovsk and Kurakhove, Russia's movement towards the Dnipro region has slowed a bit. The Russians have not been able to break through from Novosilka to Andriivka. After the full occupation of Yasnove, the Russian forces have not launched an assault on Andriivka, instead attempting to bypass it from the south. With no significant progress from the Russians on this sector, fighting continues on the outskirts of Ospenivka, where the Ukrainian forces continue to hold.
Yeah.
And now let's get into the main event, the encirclement of Pokrovsk, and more importantly, why the Russians strategically need to take this city intact.
Ну все, с Богом! Господи! Воздух, смотри!
The situation around Pokrovsk is worsening day by day. This week saw a record of 520 clashes, and the Russian forces amassing more troops in the area. The number is likely to rise. Meanwhile, on other sections of the front, Russian attacks have not increased, and in some areas, they have even decreased, indicating the Russians' priority at this time. Russian troops are attempting to advance from both the east and west of the city to encircle it. The focus of battles is concentrated in two areas, from Vozdivizhenka to the Pokrovsk-Konstantinivka road in the east, and around the villages of Udachny and Kotlyne to the west of Pokrovsk. Near Vozdivizhenka, the Russians have made no significant progress but are gathering resources to launch a new offensive towards Baranivka and Yelizavetovka, expanding the front to increase their chances of reaching the road. For similar reasons, they attacked from Timofivka toward the buffer zone near Vozdivizhenka, later taking control of this territory. On the western flank, despite expanding their control zone between Kotlyne and Zbirove and advancing north to cut off the road to Pokrovsk, Ukrainian forces are holding their defenses in both villages and preventing further Russian advances westward toward the Dnipro region. Intense fighting continues in Udachny, where the Ukrainian defense forces maintain advantageous positions and conduct local counterattacks. In one of these counterattacks, they pushed the Russians out of the village's outskirts. Strategically, Russian forces will likely continue expanding the front to the north to reach the critical logistics route from Pokrovsk to Pavlohrad and westward toward the Dnipro region to secure their flanks. Despite the Russian claims of fighting for Pokrovsk, Ukrainian media maintains that their forces remain 5 kilometers away from the city. However, they do admit that sabotage groups occasionally appear within the city. Now here's where we get into Colonel Marcus Reisner's, the Austrian expert's, insights into the Russian tactics around Pokrovsk and, more importantly, the importance of taking the city intact. The Russians need a logistics network because otherwise the supply routes to the front will be increasingly overstretched in the distance. So they have logistically too long and easily attackable supply lines, the colonel said. Southwest of Pokrovsk there is a small town called Kotlyne, where they have already advanced north via the railway line. Videos have shown how the Ukrainians are trying to hit the Russian soldiers there with first-person view drones or FPV drones. However, it is also very clear on the videos that the railway line itself is essentially intact and only has minor repairable damage. It can be assumed that the Russians want to use the railway line in the long term, provided that it is possible, precisely because this route would offer itself as a logistics route for any forward marches further towards the northwest or the west. In the Russian-occupied territories, there are cities that serve as logistics hubs for the Russian army, the colonel said. For example, Luhansk and Donetsk, which is located in direct extension of the axis of Pokrovsk from the southeast. Donetsk is an important supply point from which goods could be brought to Pokrovsk. From there, they would then be redistributed, first perhaps on trucks, then also by rail. Railway transports in the direction of the city have hardly taken place because the city is already under direct fire. With artillery, with gliding bombs and drones, again and again, we see videos showing FPV drones patrolling the city. When they recognize goals, they attack them. This also shows, he says, Pokrovsk is now very difficult to hold because the Russians control the center itself and all supply lines by fire. West of Pokrovsk, the railway line divides into one route, which has now been interrupted by the Russian advance, and a second, which is still free and runs parallel to an important road. Through these two lines, the road and the rail in the northwest, goods still enter the city. However, Russian FPV drones fly almost 10 kilometers. From Kotlyne, the small village that the Russians have now taken possession of at the interrupted railway line, the drones can fly to the northern railway line. It is only 6 kilometers away. This means that the Russians can continuously inform them there regarding Pokrovsk and its surroundings and the access possibilities. This makes it increasingly difficult for the Ukrainians to bring forces there. In the south, southwest, and southeast, Pokrovsk is already covered. However, the northern area is still under Ukrainian control. This gives them the opportunity to continue to maintain the city for the time being. Only when the situation deteriorates significantly, it will be abandoned. Like Velyka Novosilka, south of Pokrovsk. The place is much smaller and already enclosed from 3 sides. We clearly see that the Ukrainians are trying to bring equipment out of the city. This is not easy. Even if this happens in the individual march, the device is often recognized, fought, and also destroyed by the Russians. In the end, soldiers often try to break out in small groups. Now lastly, when the colonel was asked by the interviewer why the city of Pokrovsk is so valuable to the Ukrainians and whether it is worth all the effort and troops trying to defend it, this was his response. The colonel answered, yes, because due to the overstretching of the supply lines, i.e. from Donetsk to the front, it is becoming increasingly difficult for the Russians to bring material forward. Recently, another video circulated. 2 Russian motorcyclists were driving on a road towards the city, and the road was dotted with destroyed Russian and Ukrainian war equipment. Craters were visible on the left and the right. The Ukrainians can operate on this road with artillery and drones. This shows how difficult it is to overcome the distances to the front. That is why it would be so useful from the Russian point of view to establish Pokrovsk as a new logistics hub. In addition, the city was a hub for coal and lithium production, and as such it would be useful for the Russians. That is why they want to get their hands on the city as unharmed as possible, and that is why it is still being defended by the Ukrainians.
Zelensky is obviously a cokehead. All the signs are there. You give him $1 billion, the next week he's broke. He's always wearing the same dirty t-shirt that Sean Penn gave him. He's always saying delusional shit like, I'm gonna defeat Russia.
So gents, I hope you found this video very informative and insightful about Pokrovsk and the southern Donbas front line for this past week. I advise you to take a look at this trailer video here as to the benefits offered by joining the WIPS channel membership community. I'll also post this link for another video on Pokrovsk which I recently did, which I think will also be very informative to the war enthusiasts.